So I know that this isn't at all easy for her. And therefore, I am so very proud today to present to you Morati Imi, Frida Feifer, from the depths of despair to the fulfillment of a dream.
All right? Yeah. I was born in Kovna, Lithuania, where I spent the first 4 years of my life. Then, my family, which included my parents, my 2 older siblings, Hinda and Harry, and myself, relocated to Šiauliai, Shavel, as we call the city in Yiddish. We enjoyed a vibrant Jewish life there, complete with shuls, a Zionist Hebrew gymnasium, as well as Talmud Torahs and schools that taught in Yiddish. We had Jewish newspapers of a variety of streams. This all abruptly changed with the Russian occupation, which began on June 15, 1940. From that time on, we were no longer permitted to use the Hebrew language. In school, the language had to be Yiddish. Our Jewish education was replaced with Russian language, Soviet history, and culture. Our fear intensified when the Russians began evacuating people and sending them off to Siberia. The first victims were the bourgeoisie, the very rich. Next came the business people, even those with only 1 employee. The Soviet goal was to cleanse the land of all but the common worker. Basically, there were no criteria to define who didn't fit in their concept of what a social society should be. And nobody knew who would be next to be shipped to Siberia. This lasted a full year, until the 22nd of June, 1941, when the Germans invaded all of Lithuania. Before this time, we had heard horror stories of atrocities that were committed against Polish Jews. We found it impossible to believe. Now it was at our doorstep. We no longer were considered human beings. Anybody could do to us whatever they wanted. And we didn't expect any help from the local authorities, such as police or firefighters. Lithuanians were already murdering Jews even before the German edicts were in place. When the Germans entered Shavel, life became unbearable. We were forced to wear the infamous yellow stars front and back. We weren't permitted to walk on the sidewalk. Men were forced to remove their hats whenever a German passed by. There was plundering of private property, day and all through the night, and indiscriminate arrests of men and boys, of which my father was one. His rescue is a story in and of itself. At the time we thought that this was hell on earth, but as we all know, this was a Gan Eden compared to what followed. In late September, we were forced out of our homes and resettled in the run-down section of town, in the outskirts of the city where the poorest Lithuanians had lived. We were allotted only one room per family, no matter how many people in the family. The kitchen was shared with 1, 2, or even more families. There were 2 ghettos in Shavel. One was called Kafkaz, next to the Jewish cemetery, and the other one, the Traku, adjacent to the city shoe and leather factories. By the way, these 2 factories were owned by the richest Jews in our community, the Frankel family. They lived in a magnificent building which we call the Palace. The Frankels had left Lithuania way before the Russian occupation and donated their home to the Jewish community in Shavel. The Hebrew Gymnasia, Gymnasion Ivri de Shavli, began in this building before relocating later into a regular school building. Upon visiting my hometown this past summer with members of my family, all I could find still standing were the gymnasia, the palace, and the jail where my father was incarcerated. All the rest didn't survive the bombardment of Shavel. It was very frustrating to me not to find even my own home where I spent my youth or anything else familiar to show to my family. I couldn't wait to leave the blood-soaked country. Let me now continue to tell you about the unbearable life in the ghetto. The ghetto was surrounded by a barbed wire. The gate was guarded by the Nazis and their Lithuanian conspirators. All able-bodied men, women, and children were sent to work, either on the airport, on construction, or just to clean the streets or any other job, just for humiliation. And the Lithuanians were standing around, making fun and enjoying the sight. Food was rationed, and bringing anything into the ghetto was often punished harshly. In some cases, even public hanging. I was assigned to the airport, carrying construction material that I could hardly lift. We had to march to and from work in formation. The workday began early in the morning and concluded late in the day. It was winter, and even though it was very cold, we were chased away from the fire, and they didn't allow us to even warm our hands. For 2 summers, I was sent to a work camp far from the ghetto. This was the first time in my life of 17 years that I was separated from my family. The work consisted of digging in mud pits. This was a special type of mud which we called turf. This mud was placed on boards which we then carried to the fields to be dumped there. The mud dried over the summer and was then used as fuel. The boards with the mud on it were so heavy that you could just collapse under their weight. From time to time there were selections in the ghetto. Then we had no idea where the selected were taken. Today we know that the concentration camps were their destination and death was their fate. As the number of people decreased, there was no more need for 2 ghettos. We were all put into one ghetto, the Traku, the one that was situated near the shoe factory. My father, Alav Shalom, who worked there, managed to get me a job on the sewing machines. This was most welcome change after having endured and done hard work all the previous times. From the windows of the factory, we could observe everything that happened in the ghetto. One morning, we saw the Nazis round up all the children. They went from house to house, pulling babies and children of all ages from their families and brutally shoving them into the waiting trucks. Parents and grandparents were desperately looking for places to hide their children. Children themselves were looking for hiding places. The brutal assessment left no stone unturned, even entering outhouses and roughly pulling the children out. Children running in the street were shot without as much as a second thought. The head of our Judenrat asked the Germans, asked the Nazis, where are you taking these children? What will happen to the children? And they said, don't you worry, they are going to a good place. And he kept bothering them, and he kept asking. And they answered, you know what? If you want to see, you may join them. And he was taken on this transport together with the children. This was called the Kinderaktion. Upon returning from work that day, we had to face the tragedy of the mothers and grandmothers. I'll never forget the horror of one of our neighbors who approached my mother with 2 little mittens in her hand and saying, look, Frau Danziger, what is left of my little sweet girl. This scene haunts me up to this very day. In November 1943, the Germans began losing on the Eastern Front and started retreating from Russia. Conditions in the ghetto got stricter and stricter. We felt that something was about to happen, and we lived in great fear. In June 1944, the ghetto was liquidated. The first transport, which included my family, was taken to the railway station. We were allowed to take with us as much as we could carry. We were loaded into cattle cars and pushed together like sardines. There were no water or bathroom facilities for the duration of the trip. We were brought to Stutthof concentration camp, which was located on the Baltic Sea near the city of Danzig. Upon getting off the train, they separated the men from the women. Männer rechts, Frauen links, without giving us a chance to say goodbye to one another. It was done with shouts of schnell, schnell, raus, raus. The feeling of despair and fear we had then is indescribable. That was the last time any of the women saw the men until after liberation. The women were then herded into a room where we had to undress completely. Every personal possession was ripped out of our hands, including precious family photos. This humiliation, including body cavity searches, took place in front of the SS men. I can only imagine how my mother's mother and other mothers felt, having to endure this in front of their daughters. Later came the ice-cold showers and the delousing process. Further humiliation came with the clothing